The Obama as U.S. president in waiting and the MLK in the Gold Coast, Ghana stories are but only two of several other exhilarating stories of transatlantic racial pride since Booker T. Washington made his equally then famous Atlanta Compromise speech in 1895 before an audience of white patriarchs, among whom he was the only Negro. Booker T's self-confessed nervous, but nonetheless stellar performance inspired the young Marcus Garvey and many others in the Caribbean as well as on the African continent. He was very warmly applauded by even W.E.B. Du Bois, who would, long before the first Pan-African Congress and before the publication of The Souls of Black Folk, become the personification of opposition to the doctrine of African-American self-abnegation propounded by the Wizard of Tuskegee during the dark days of Jim Crow lynching, not only in the deep south of the United States, but also in the far north as Springfield, Illinois, official hometown of Abraham Lincoln, the Emancipator. I recount all these as a way of signaling and illustrating what I mean by the notion of the dynamics and dialectics of African homeland diaspora relations. What I mean is this. First, the nature and character of relations between the homeland and the diasporas has changed and will continue to change as far as we humans breathe. That is the sense in which I deploy the notion of the dynamic. Secondly, what happens on the continent, both the good, the bad, the very pretty, and the very ugly, affects the diaspora and vice versa. This is also what I mean by asserting that this is what I mean by asserting that the relationship is a dialectical one. Thirdly, I argue that the dynamics and dialectics of homeland-diaspora relationship are conditioned by the state of race, gender, and class relations in the exercise of political and cultural power on planet Earth. This, my perspective, has been inspired by a lecture, Race, the Floating Signifier, delivered a little over a decade ago by the Jamaican-born cultural theorist Stuart Hall, the now former retired director of the currently defunct institute in Birmingham, which pioneered cultural studies. It was to Hall's work that I turned when a member of my dissertation committee, Cecilia Green, a black feminist sociologist and a member of my dissertation committee, originally from the Caribbean island of Dominica, and now the university, dampened my spirit, my initial enthusiasm for Ali's quasi-sociological notion of a global Africa, which happens to be the title of the last episode in his BBC PBS series. Guided by my dissertation co-chairs, Vicky Petraka and Don Macquarie, Masri, from my reading of his text, defines global Africa as an arithmetic sum, the arithmetic sum of the African homeland plus the diasporas of the Middle Passage and that of colonialism, colonies of voluntary exiles pushed out of the continent and pulled in by the West by the traumas of colonization and its sequel, neocolonialism. The naming, especially of my Caribbean inspirers, should not be taken as a performance in name dropping. I mention them partly to acknowledge my sources, but most importantly, I cite them out of a hunch that the radical thought of these Caribbean scholars, Stuart Hall and Cecilia Green, must have something to do with their having been born and raised in the West Indies. This is where the European Enlightenment, with its dazzling and rationalist philosophical floodlight, together with its vicious racism. Ngugi wa Thiong'o recently wrote about the dismembering practices that thrust Africa, Africans, and their descendants into the dark underbelly of the European Enlightenment. This radical thought first made its deepest impact on the racialized order in the Western Hemisphere, in the Caribbean. Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution, C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins, Chancellor Williams's Capitalism and Slavery, Sir Arthur Lewis's founding of development economics as a basis for a thoroughgoing critique of classical economic thought from Ricardo and Adam Smith through Karl Marx and beyond, plus the many other cultural practices and personalities that have hailed from these islands. These islands were the first survivors of the Middle Passage, were disgorged from the hulls of those notorious slave galleons, enslaved Africans whose cheap, unfree laboring was to be followed by indentured servitude of East Indian souls imported to work in the cane fields after emancipation. Before their deaths, in 1968 and 1972 respectively, the public service careers of the movement's two most prominent international icons, Martin Luther King Jr. and Kwame Nkrumah, had come to a screeching halt as they sought to broaden their ideological outlook and political vision by a vigorous critique of Western imperialism and the Vietnam War. Many of those they had led and inspired had become very busy, or rather too busy, pursuing professions in African neocolonialism and the American corporate world to really care about what next for the people they had pledged to serve, too busy seeking as best they could an accommodation with white supremacy a la Booker T. Washington. Might this new accommodationism perhaps be the reason why post-independence Pan-Africanism has failed to capture the imagination as the Manchester Conference and the All-Africa Congress had done? After watching and studying Louis Masri's The Africans, both the TV series and the accompanying book, I began to warm up to the idea that classical Pan-Africanism is quite ill. Reading the television and written text through the lens of Stuart Hall's racial floating signifiers, I reached a more or less definitive conclusion that classical Pan-Africanism, which still survives somewhat in name, in neo-colonial form, in several organizations, student university programs identifying themselves by the modifier Pan-Africanism, was still half alive, on life support, but clinically brain dead. It has lost much, perhaps most, of the radical anti-colonial edge that made its pre-independence forebear the mobilizing ideological instrument in the aftermath of the 1945 Manchester Congress and the 1958 All-Africa Congress. Some self-described Pan-Africanists have been arguing that Arab North Africa, once led by Abdel Gamal Nasser, is not welcome to the Pan-African Club. Why? Because they have light skins and their hair is not kinky. This implied that one had to be dark-skinned, kinky-haired to be Pan-Africanist. Arabs are, they argued, according to the taxonomy of humanity, according to phenotype. I concurred with Mazrui very much in support of my dissertation program, Black Whiteness, White Blackness, and the Making of African American, Global African Identities.